Dementia is one of the leading causes of death worldwide, and its effects have left lasting impacts on individuals, families, and the neuroscience community. As the research progresses, the understanding of the disease as well as treatment options has expanded dramatically. That's why we're so excited to have on Toby Curless, aka Toby the Neuroscientist, a PhD student currently researching dementia to explore the neurology behind dementia and Alzheimer's and discuss how dementia is currently perceived in our social landscape. Welcome to BS, a podcast where we take an in-depth look at different scientific and social phenomena and innovations whilst tying them back to broader societal perspectives and why you should care. We're super stoked to have Toby on, and we really hope you guys enjoy the episode.
Welcome back, guys. Today we have a very exciting guest lecturer today, Toby, aka Toby the Neuroscientist, and he's here with us to demystify some things regarding dementia and Alzheimer's and just educate us all, even me and Ileana, about just certain things about these diseases and where the research is currently at.
Yeah. So we're so happy to have you on. Gold is the neuroscience one, like I've already said. I am not, so I feel like I'll be following along more during this episode. Maybe not as much contributing to the discourse, but I'll be here. I'll be here silently in the background. Um, but first, before we get into like Alzheimer's and dementia specific questions, we really just wanted to ask about you. I know that on your platform, you've talked a lot about how you've kind of had an unconventional journey to becoming a PhD, conducting dementia research. And so we just wanted to ask, like, what has your academia journey looked like, and what have kind of been the biggest lessons you've learned along the way to getting to kind of like your dream PhD?
So I say it's an unconventional journey for a few reasons. Firstly, I think a lot of people know that they want to do a PhD at a very young age, and I didn't realize I wanted to do a PhD until just before I started my PhD. Actually, when I was at school, I wanted to be an actor. I was thinking of going to drama school, and I was being pressured to go to drama school, but I thought I probably won't earn any money by doing that. Let's be sensible. But I also wanted to be a medical doctor. I really liked the idea of helping people, and I thought that would be something I was good at. But at school, I was quite a lazy kid. I'd been put in the gifted kids group, and in my head, that meant I didn't have to do any work. So for the vast majority of my life, I was very, very lazy. And I left school unhappy with the grades that I finished with. So I took a year out. I worked as a waiter in a restaurant, and it was during this year out that my grandfather passed away with Alzheimer's disease. And I thought, no, that's it. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do dementia stuff. But I didn't know how to do that. I didn't. There weren't really many resources out there saying this is what you need to do if you want to do dementia research. So I did my undergrad degree in cellular and molecular biology, and throughout the 3 years of that, I hated most of it. I realized I do not care about plants. I do not care about bacteria, microbiology, any of that stuff. We had one lecture on the brain, and I thought, yes, this is it. That's for me. That's what I want to do. So I graduated from that degree just in the middle of COVID, and I took a year out again working as a waiter, trying to save up some money. And I just completely by chance stumbled across a master's degree at UCL, which is where I'm based now. And UCL is kind of regarded as the center of neuroscience in Europe. And I thought this is going to be a bit ambitious of me to apply for a neuroscience degree with no neuroscience background. But lo and behold, they took me. While I was in my second year of my undergrad degree, I got involved in a traffic accident and suffered quite a few issues as a result of that, including PTSD and a lot of physical damage. And because of this, it completely reshaped how I had to teach myself to learn things again. I really struggled with focus and memory and concentration. So I really, really devoted myself to studying, and I worked 12-hour days every day throughout the entirety of my master's degree. And I loved it. I loved it so much. Every single day of that master's degree, we had the world leading expert in Alzheimer's disease, doctors talking to us about the medical side of things, scientists talking to us about the science side of things. And I thought it was the most incredible experience. And then I finished that master's degree and I thought, I can't do a PhD. I still don't know that much. I don't know what I want to do a PhD in. And one piece of advice I would give to anyone who is looking to get a career in research who wants to do a PhD, get a position as a research technician or a research assistant for a couple of years beforehand. If you choose the right position, it will feel like a PhD. You're doing the same kinds of work, you'll be involved in the same kinds of discussion, but you earn a heck of a lot more money and you don't have that added pressure of doing the PhD. So I did that for 2 years working on Parkinson's disease and I loved it. And I learned some really, really cool techniques in the lab. And then sheerly through networking, I managed to secure myself this PhD position, which is where I find myself today. And I've just turned 27 and I actually applied for a PhD at the end of my undergrad that I didn't. I'm so glad I didn't get, and I didn't even really want to do it. But had I done that PhD, I already would have graduated by now. I would be Dr. Toby, but I still have another 2.5 years left until I am Dr. Toby. But it was unconventional, but I think I've realized that there's not a single aspect of it that I would change. And I think that's an incredibly important thing to realize is that everyone's journey is different and you have to do the one that's right for you, not the one that is the most popular.
No, for sure. I felt very similarly to you when you were discussing like your path towards neuroscience. It's not like I completely wasn't interested in the biology of non-human subjects, but it was very much so this is interesting. It's nice to hear somebody else talk about it or to learn very minuscule things about it, but I was not necessarily drawn to it or motivated to like dedicate a very large portion of my life to it. But I think when I had like my first AP Psych class, that really like piqued my interest about just like how much I want to know about humans and the way we are. But I was definitely more on a objectivity and science aspect of it. I was super, super interested in psych and social, but like that led me towards neuroscience as well. And I definitely had the same similar feelings with you in terms of like taking breaks in between different areas of education of like, oh, if I would have started at X point, I would have already been done or had this label or had this experience. But I mean, I feel like your journey shows that honestly, you will always just like land where you need to be. So I think it was interesting and like really cool that you had, all of these experiences before you decided to pursue your PhD.
Yeah, I think perseverance is something that you definitely demonstrated. Once again, sorry for your car accident. I know that how, but I'm glad that you were able to power through it. Obviously, I'm not on the neuroscience end of things. I'm on more of the engineering bio side of things, but same thing of like, I was so much more interested in biology, I think, than other disciplines of science, which is what really got, and then I enjoyed like the intersection of like STEM slash engineering with being able to help people. And then what you said about like not going into grad school like immediately, like so real, just because I feel like both Gold and I have like taken breaks from undergrad, but we also both plan to go back to grad school. And I think for me, it was about deconstructing the idea that I had to do everything by my 30s. Like that to me was like the biggest thing. I don't know if you two have ever felt this, but like I would just felt so much pressure. I don't know why to like have all my degrees completed by 30, be super successful, be in a successful relationship, blah, blah, blah. And I had to like say like, no, it's okay to like take time, learn exactly what you're interested in, explore a variety of different experiences
before you decide to go back to grad school. And like, it's okay if I'm still in grad school in my late 20s / early 30s. But before, like, if you had talked to Ileana, like coming into college, I'd have been like, no, I'm doing my undergrad. I'm going straight to my master. I hadn't even considered PhDs until I worked in a research lab. And now I'm considering a PhD. So it's just like, it's so confusing once you really get into it, but you start out and you think it's just going to be this one, like, straightforward path, like an airplane runway, but like it really isn't. So yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that massively. I think I still do to some extent have this fear in my head because I will be 30 when I finish my PhD. And historically, I always thought I'm going to have kids when I'm 30. I'm going to be married. A wedding on a PhD stipend, that's not going to. So,
Right.
Air.
yeah.
We'll be serving ramen at the reception, but it's all right. You gotta do what you have to do. So yeah, today we'll be talking all things Alzheimer's and dementia. And we just wanted to jump in and talk about just the pop culture understanding of what dementia as a disease is and how Alzheimer's is like often just characterized with a overarching symptom of memory loss. However, like there is a lot of complexity to the disease and its development and its characteristics. And we just wanted to know if you can explain to the audience like what Alzheimer's / dementia is and like what issues or conditions in the brain that we currently know of lead to the development of these diseases.
Yeah, so I think the biggest misconception that people have is that all dementia is Alzheimer's disease. Dementia it's just a word that we use as an umbrella term that covers a whole load of symptoms. And it's the combination of those symptoms together that makes it dementia. In order to get a diagnosis of dementia, those symptoms all have to reach a point where it affects someone's ability to go about their day-to-day life as they usually would. So dementia in and of itself is not a disease. It's just a group of symptoms. And dementia is caused by physical diseases of the brain. There are about 100 different diseases that cause dementia. Alzheimer's is by far the most common of those diseases. And it's correct that memory loss is associated with Alzheimer's disease, but memory loss doesn't have to be a characteristic of dementia, certainly not in the early stages of dementia. So, frontotemporal dementia, for example, you would expect to see behavioral changes and language changes, but not memory problems early on in the disease. So, with Alzheimer's disease, the reason that memory loss is so prominent is that the key area of the brain that is affected early on in disease is called the hippocampus, which is involved in our ability to form short-term memories. So typically what you'll see in someone with Alzheimer's disease is that they are able to recall things from their past, from their distant past, but things that have happened to them this week, last week, in the past couple of days, they really struggle because they can't form those new memories. And that's kind of one of the earliest signs that you would see in people. In terms of what causes these diseases, of course, it changes and it depends on what disease we're talking about. One question that I get asked a lot is how much does genetics play a part? And in dementia as a whole, genetic causes of disease are rare. Only 1 in 100 cases of dementia is directly due to you inheriting a gene that guarantees that you develop the condition. In the vast majority of cases, we don't know the exact pinpoint cause because it's a combination of genetic risks, which are different to genetic causes. It's a combination of risk, our environment, our diet, our lifestyle, how much exercise we're getting, whether we've got any underlying health conditions, high LDL cholesterol, whether we smoke, whether we drink too much, hearing loss in later life, eyesight problems. All of these can combine and determine how likely someone is to develop these conditions.
For sure. It's definitely multifactorial, which I think people sometimes can struggle to like really wrap their head around. And listen, I'm guilty of this too. Like you go on WebMD and then like you read through the list of symptoms and you're like, oh my God, I'm going to die in 5 days from this super obscure disease state. But I think it's definitely important for people to understand that like there's so many different things that can contribute to it, and it's not like an immediate like seal of like, oh, this person is going to get it, oh, this person is not going to get it.
Yeah, and I also think the brain is just such a complicated organ, and neuroscience in general just has so much discovery and understanding to still do. Like the amount of things that could just immediately start short circuiting because you don't get enough sleep, talk less, all of the other aspects of your brain health and your like mental well-being that are going along with it. So it is sometimes hard to like give people those pinpoints, especially with something that can be quite scary like dementia. I do think people want to know, what do I need to be eating? How much do I need to be sleeping? You know, all of my grandparents had it. Like, how do I like basically save myself from that fate? And with honestly, a lot of the other things with the human body, it's just never that easy. And it's always a very like complicated like situation with multiple moving parts. And like that's just literally exponentialized in neuroscience in general.
For sure. When people call the brain the self-naming organ, it freaks me out. I'm always just like, oh my God, like that is such like conscientiousness, like third world. I can't do it. Like, so obviously you've kind of given us like a broad understanding of like the symptoms that characterize Alzheimer's, but it's a neurodegenerative disease. Oh my God, I can't speak. Neurodegenerative disease, which means it obviously like progresses over time and gets worse as the disease state progresses. So, what are kind of the signs and symptoms within each stage, and how does it progress to the point that somebody can like die from Alzheimer's? So, I know there's like early, middle, and late is how I've heard it classified in the past. But yeah, just take us through kind of like what the progression of it can look like.
Yeah, so the I don't want to say interesting because it's not, but something interesting about Alzheimer's disease is that it's characterized by plaques and tangles, which I'm sure we'll talk about later in more detail. But the changes that start happening in the brain can be happening 20, 30 years before someone shows any symptoms at all. And that's really important to bear in mind. You then, in the very early stages of the disease, you will see things like, probably most noticeably in Alzheimer's disease, memory loss, changes to someone's memory. But of course, every person is different. And so there is a really, really wide spectrum of symptoms that you might see in someone. We see behavior, personality changes, problems with language processing, problems with being able to perceive things, decision making. And throughout the progression of the disease, the easiest way to think about it is that every different bit of your brain has a different job and a different function. And so, as these clumps of protein are moving throughout your brain and leading to the death of brain cells, the area that it gets to, that's in charge of a function. And when it gets to that part of the brain, you're not going to be able to perform that function as well as you previously could. So the changes that you will see in behavior and personality will just get stronger and more marked. And the same with memory problems, for example. You can also see people starting to have problems with their movement, their ability to move around. And also later on in disease, you might see hallucinations, for example. But not every single person with Alzheimer's disease will experience exactly the same set of symptoms. And that's one of the things that makes dementia as a whole really difficult to diagnose, because there are a lot of overlapping conditions that all look somewhat similar. When it comes to how can these diseases actually cause someone to pass away, there's a few different ways that are probably most common. So it gets to a point where essentially your brain is just so severely damaged that the core basic functions that we need our brain to tell us to do to be able to survive stop working. So a lot of people will die with pneumonia. So it gets to a point where their ability to swallow food and chew food and process food doesn't work properly. And that can lead to food entering the lungs, and that causes an infection. And when you are unwell, when your brain is unwell, your immune system is less able to fight things off. So you've already got a weakened immune system. And so quite frequently you'll see people with pneumonia passing away. Things like UTIs as well, for the same reason. People might be likely to pass away with a UTI because their immune system just can't work. But it's essentially just getting to a point where the core functions that we need for our brain to let us survive as humans, those are all just being stripped away one by one. And it gets to a point where your body can't cope. So people can't swallow anymore. Sometimes people will pass away because they are unable to eat or drink anything, although that's not particularly common.
Yeah, I've heard like sometimes it can get to a point where like they don't dress appropriately for like the weather, they can't shower, they can't clothe themselves. So I'm assuming that in those later stages of the disease, there's like a heavy emphasis on like caretaking, specifically for like family and stuff like that.
Yeah, massively so. And it's the problem with dementia is that it is so stigmatized. And what people don't realize is that 1 in 2 people in their lifetime will be affected by dementia, either because they're going to get dementia themselves, or they're going to care for someone with dementia, or
Mhm.
both. And it's not spoken about enough. And one thing, every time I speak to someone who has a family member with dementia, is they did not realize how much care is needed to be given, the effort and the work that goes into it. It's a financial drain on that person if they need someone to go into a care home, for example. It's incredibly difficult. And from my own personal experience, seeing my mum every week drive 4 hours every weekend to go and see my grandpa and just look after him and dress him, feed him, bathe him. It's incredibly demanding on the caregivers as well. And I think that's not spoken about anywhere near enough.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Like I've had similar experiences with, again, being a caretaker for someone who has like 24-hour need care, not specifically in relation to dementia, but again, it's a very overwhelming thing. And I feel like it almost becomes part of your identity because of how much time and energy and thought that it takes up out of you in order to be a caretaker. And I feel like, especially for people who are, again, getting Alzheimer's, getting dementia in the later area of their life, it might be the first time that their children, their grandchildren have ever experienced being in the position or the role of a caretaker. So I wonder, like, from your family's perspective, like, do you have any advice for their well-being, or also any advice in terms of the way that they could best care for their family member who's going through that? Like obviously it'll be varied between the person, the dynamic, the stage of the disease they're at, the way it's impacting them or progressing. But I wonder if there was just any like general advice that you would give for families going through that situation.
Yeah, there's a few, and of course, everything I say is just my own personal opinion. Everyone needs to make decisions themselves, but there's a couple of things that I want to talk about on that. Firstly, is this concept of something called a love lie. When people have Alzheimer's disease, they're not going to suddenly snap out of it. And the most important thing, and the thing that I wish that we as a family had realized earlier, is that you need to meet the person where they are. If it gets to a point in disease where they start asking where their mum is and their mum passed away 20 years ago, do not tell them that. They will forget that they've asked that and they will ask it the next time. Meet them where they are. You ask them, where do you think they are? And then if they say, oh, I think she might be at the shops, then you say, yes, I think that's right. There's a difference between lying to someone out of malice and lying to someone because it's the correct thing to do. And so I think that's one skill that I think is incredibly important for people to understand, because by meeting that person where they are, you are massively reducing stress and anxiety in them. And it's, I think, the best thing that you can possibly do. On the same topic, though, the biggest piece of advice for me is you can't take care of someone, especially not in that context when it's so demanding. You can't take care of someone unless you yourself are being taken care of. You need to make sure that you prioritize yourself and look after your own mental health and understand what your capacities are. There are some in the UK at least, I don't know about in the States, but there are some really great charities out there that have helplines of trained people, trained nurses who deal with dementia as their primary focus, who are really well equipped to give people resources that they can follow and advice on what to do in the early stages, what can we expect to see coming forwards. And so the big piece of advice is don't go through it on your own. Make sure that you are accessing all of the support networks that you can, whether that's friends and families or charities. That is what they are there for, and they're an incredibly valuable resource.
Yeah. I'm glad you both touched on caretaker fatigue because I know that it's something that across like a broad spectrum of diseases that like you said like people are suffering from every single day or like are going through it, but it's not necessarily something that like we talk about out loud as a society. I think that's also why social media has been such a powerful tool for connecting people who are sharing those similar experiences of taking care of a loved one who is going through something similar to this, and just kind of like, once again, the toll that it can take on yourself. So, for all the caretakers out there, take care of yourself, please. And like Toby said, get the help that you need in order to be able to support yourself and your loved ones. So you did touch already kind of on how dementia is stigmatized, and how we don't speak to it once again to like the volume of people who are going through it. Obviously, dementia is just an umbrella term for a variety of different neurological disorders. And for people who don't have lots of experience, it can be like a lot of information to kind of take in at once. And we know your platform focuses on helping people understand the science behind that, especially once again, as somebody who's had those personal experiences. So, what are kind of the biggest misconceptions that you've come across when talking about dementia and Alzheimer's, that you really seek to combat? Obviously, you kind of already discussed like dementia is not one singular disease, it's like a variety of different disorders. But what other kind of stereotypes or misconceptions come up when discussing Alzheimer's?
There's, I get into, I don't like arguing on the internet, but I do find myself getting really angry at people telling me that I'm wrong about things that I've studied for a long time. There's
Uh,
a couple.
Especially, at least in the US, in this political climate, don't even get us
Oh
started.
no, it's seeping
Like at
across
this
stuff.
point, it's a canon event. Like if you have not argued with somebody who has only maybe saw two Twitter posts about the very complicated subject, like did you even get your degree? Did you
I'm
even?
and like if that blurry Facebook video is what they're using as expertise over your literal PhD, like how are you a scientist if they haven't directly challenged you on those grounds?
Yeah. Um, I think there's a few things that annoy me. There's one where people say that genetics has nothing to do with it, and I know I'm biased. I study genetics. My whole PhD is in genetics, but we know that there are people who have genetic mutations that guarantee that they will develop dementia, and usually early onset dementia. And I think I don't mind people not understanding topics, of course, because you can't understand everything in the world. But when it directly affects someone else, when I see in my comments section people saying, no, it's nothing to do with genetics, there are people who are maybe watching that video who have a genetic family history of the disease. And so that's one thing that grinds my gears a little bit. And obviously, not every single case of dementia is entirely related to genetics, but we wouldn't be us without all of our genetics. It's incredibly complex, and so you can't just say it's not a binary issue like that. With relation to genetics, people quite often say to me that dementia is just a part of getting older. It's just what happens when you get old, you just start forgetting things. And really, when you understand that dementia is, as a result in Alzheimer's disease, specifically as a result of 30, 40 years worth of disease related changes happening in your brain, I think it makes it a lot more palatable and a lot easier to understand and explain to people why perhaps someone's behavior has changed. Because getting older isn't just an excuse, but if you can actually talk things through and explain, no, this is a physical disease in the brain. Parts of this person's brain are dying, and that is why they are acting this way. I think that's a really, really key principle to get across. is the fact that these are physical diseases, and just because you can't necessarily see them, it doesn't make the effects of them any less true.
Yeah, I honestly have heard every single one that you discussed, and I think to the relation of that last one about dementia and specifically Alzheimer's being a physical disease, I think there sometimes is almost like a victim blaming aspect for the way people act when they have Alzheimer's. I've heard things saying like people saying things like Alzheimer's just cannot change your personality. And I'm just like,
That is
where do
kind of
you think like the like basis of your personality is located? It's not in the ether, like it's in your brain. You see, especially if you're living every day a little bit confused, you're having areas of your brain literally impacted, and it's just like almost hearing people being blamed for the way that they're walking through this disease. Like I've always thought that that was just like the craziest misconception, that like you get to hold on to everything that makes you you and who you are, despite you, again, being confused and probably aggravated, scared every single day, losing your memories, losing other functions of your body. And you're just supposed to wake up and take agency for every emotion that you feel and every like decision that you make. Like I always thought that was such the most like insensitive misconception.
I think people just also have a problem with things they don't A, fully understand, and like B, the more like negative kind of grimy underside of like diseases. And I feel like we see that a lot with mental health as well, where it's just like people will feel bad about the parts of depression that I guess are socially acceptable, like the more sad parts. But then when it gets to maybe potentially uncleanliness, like the people who can't take a shower every day, brush their teeth every single day because they're suffering so heavily, then it becomes like a you're so nasty. Like, how are you not able to do that? Like, I do it every day, so you should be able to. And everybody goes through things and blah, 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 blah. So I think when it comes to, once again, like the more anger or the uncleanliness or anything that people think is unsavory, they stop attributing it once again to like this person is a sick person and they're not themselves. And instead, it becomes like self responsibility that that person needs to be held accountable for, which is like a very unhealthy way. And once again, just further contributes to stigmatizing these disorders because nobody wants to now come out and say that they're suffering from this if they feel like it's going to be held against to them in a very negative way.
Yeah, like Ileana, I think you honestly make a great point. And I also feel like having someone or something to blame is just easier, because if you can see somebody lose their personality, their sense of self, and their agency from, a physical issue, I think it makes people question their own agency, which is why we see so much pushback in terms of Alzheimer's, mental health disorders, even conversations regarding free will. I just think it's just a difficult like mirror to look at, that like you are not infallible to the issues that may go on with your body. And honestly, on the topic of how Alzheimer's progresses and the way it can change you, I did want to go and revisit our conversations of like the main things that are associated with Alzheimer's, because I know when I was in my undergrad, like they were always hammering in amyloid beta plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. With tau proteins, and like literally like those are just the two things you could not forget when discussing Alzheimer's, particularly Alzheimer's research. And before we get into these like more heavy research questions, Toby, I just wanted to ask you if you can clear up, what AB plaques are and what NFTs are and how they're utilized in Alzheimer's research.
Yeah. So I think the easiest way to think about how biology works is with analogies for me. So I always use a cooking analogy when I'm explaining proteins, etc. So we have our DNA. Our DNA is just a giant cookery book that has all of the instructions for every recipe we'll ever need to make. Now, these final dishes that we're making, those are proteins, and every protein has its own unique, different function. Every page of our cookery book is a recipe, and that is a gene. So one gene gives you the instructions to make one protein. And in the middle of that, we have RNA. This is the temporary shopping list that you write so that you don't have to take your whole cookery book to the supermarket with you. And so you copy down temporary instructions into your shopping list, and that goes off and you assemble your protein. So amyloid beta, tau, these are proteins that have normal functions. Tau, for example, is what I study, and it's really important in the brain. If we think of our brain cells as these long tubes, tau is like a scaffolding protein that holds it all together. What we know is, and not just in the context of dementia, but many different diseases as well, is that these are proteinopathies. Something's going wrong with the proteins. So what happens in Alzheimer's disease is usually we have normal amyloid beta. This gets chopped up into little fragments. So amyloid is made by the APP gene. We also have two other genes, presenilin 1 and presenilin 2, and these are involved in chopping up the amyloid protein. So in people with mutations in APP or presenilin 1, presenilin 2, these people are pretty much guaranteed to develop Alzheimer's disease, because those are the very first changes that go wrong in the disease, is we start to see the formation of these clumps of the amyloid protein all clumping together. These fragments clump up together outside nerve cells in the brain. And it's difficult to say exactly what is going on, exactly what problems that's causing, but it seems to disrupt the ways that our brain cells actually communicate with each other. So when we have the buildup of these amyloid plaques, this is naturally going to make our brain in a less healthy state. Maybe we aren't able to clean up all of the other proteins that we usually would be able to clean up. So these plaques start spreading throughout the brain. And this is what I was saying earlier about this can be happening 20, 30 years before someone shows any symptoms. And then at some point in this disease process, the tau protein starts misfolding. It actually gets hyperphosphorylated, which is just a fancy way of saying some extra chemicals get added to it and it starts tangling up into shapes it shouldn't. And this gets clogged up inside nerve cells in the brain. And we think this is what is directly leading to those brain cells dying. And this disease process of the amyloid plaques spreading throughout the brain, and then you get to a point where you have tau starting to misfold inside brain cells and clump up. This spreads throughout the brain, and the further the tau gets through the brain, the worse someone's symptoms are, essentially.
Thank you for breaking that down for us. I know that it can, once again, be like very heavy science and people are like, what's going on? But yeah, even for me as somebody like outside of neuroscience, I was constantly hearing about like tau and amyloid beta and like those two proteins specifically and how it's just like, do not forget about those in relation to dementia. So.
Yeah, and another interesting thing, and honestly, I heard this far before I even started my neuroscience degree, when I was like somewhere in like sophomore, junior year of high school, is in association with Alzheimer's and dementia. I've tried to do my own research on this, but I do think right now it is a very fuzzy area in neuroscience. It definitely like caught me out of whim personally because again, like this was at a point where again, like I had such a very like layman's pop culture understanding of Alzheimer's as a memory loss situation. So like the introduction of its like possible associations with like diabetes was something that was very interesting to me. Could you break down why some people may use the term type 3 diabetes in relation to Alzheimer's and what the research is currently saying about how Alzheimer's and diabetes may relate?
Yeah, so I want to start this by saying I don't really like the term type 3 diabetes when it comes to Alzheimer's. And that's not because I disagree with the science, but I think that when a lay audience, when you say to someone in the street, oh, Alzheimer's is actually type 3 diabetes, I think that introduces a level of danger to the conversation because it allows people to be far more judgmental. It allows people to just say, oh, if it's diabetes, just sort your diet out and you'll be fine. When we actually know that it's a lot more complicated than that. But at the root of what this is getting at is that diabetes is associated with insulin. Insulin is what controls our blood sugar levels. And we know in type 2 diabetes, having type 2 diabetes is a confirmed risk factor for dementia. If you have type 2 diabetes, you are slightly more likely to develop dementia. And we do, in the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease, see problems with insulin processing, suggesting that there are issues going on with the blood glucose levels in the brain, with our sugar supply in the brain. And so I do understand how these links are made. However, I think unless you can sit down with someone and explain to them this is not something that strictly diet is just going to fix, I think it's better that we just leave them as two separate diseases and accept that maybe there are certain similarities in certain places, but these are two separate diseases.
No, I definitely. Oh, sorry. You can go ahead, Ileana.
No, this was just gonna be a side note of like, this is actually why I love the podcast, because my inner nerd always comes out, because I had like never heard of type 3 diabetes or like this link between Alzheimer's and diabetes before Gold put this question in. So I was just gonna say, like, you learn something every day, and I researched it like before coming in, and I was like, oh, that's so interesting. Like, I didn't even know that there was a link between those things. So yeah, it was just me nerding out. You can continue.
No, honestly, like Toby, you kind of confirmed my fears about the use of the terminology type 3 diabetes. I mean, this is something that we talk about oftentimes with the podcast, where it's just like, our job as science communicators, whether you're on a more casual social platform, whether you're writing peer-reviewed papers, whether you're writing like regular papers for the general population, like it should be curated for the group that you're trying to make understand it. And I feel like using a term like type 3 diabetes is something that I just feel like is not gonna go over well in the way that people understand Alzheimer's and dementia, and the like understanding that people have of diabetes, and the fact that honestly there was just a big gray area and gap from jumping from one to the other. So it's like the term honestly came far before any kind of like education or context did, at least to me, like the general population. And I feel the same, where it's just like it could be tricky using that terminology as a way to define Alzheimer's, because I think unknowingly it's simplifying it just from the way that people are going to view it just by hearing that term. And again, like now we're even combining some stigmas, because I feel like there's already stigma with type 2 diabetes, there's already stigma with Alzheimer's, there's so much victim blaming on both sides of like both like diseases. So it's just like combining the two, and just like not, again, like it not coming with a like a large load of like education with it, I feel like could be jumping the gun.
For
Yeah,
sure.
I think I don't hate where this idea has come from, but like you say, there's stigma not just in the Alzheimer's field, but also most people don't really understand diabetes either. And so by conflating the two terms, I don't think it's particularly helpful. I think if you are going to publish a paper or publish an article written about it, you have to be accepting that people are going to just read the headline and not not delve any further into that. So you have to be as clear as possible about what you actually mean with the words that you're saying.
No, you guys perfectly voiced what I was gonna say. And there's like whether people want to accept it or not, there is some responsibility, I think, when it comes to like communicating about science to the public, that people don't always wield the best, which we've discussed before on the podcast. And I feel like, especially in times like this, where the authority of scientific institutions is constantly being put into question, like it's not great to once again go around kind of touting buzzwords at the end of the day that are going to make people more scared than they already are. And not to sound like a beat a dead horse every episode, but I think issues with both of these diseases also stem from accessibility. And so if we're not moving towards actually addressing the underlying causes of diabetes and Alzheimer's, like it once again, it's just kind of like you're giving people this word that makes them even more scared for another disease that they have to look out in their lifetime without necessarily giving, once again, the proper education, research, or even resources of like, what am I supposed to do with this? Like, now that I know type 3 diabetes is a thing, like, is this going to be able to afford me to be able to eat like fresh vegetables and fruits every day, to be able to carve out the time to go to the gym? Lord knows if I'm taking care of children, I'm low income, XYZ. And so I think, like, if anything, it's just going to be another reason to blame poor people for what ends up, not to laugh because it's not funny, but it's just like, it's just going to be another reason to blame poor people for whatever diseases they end up getting. And then it gets into the whole welfare and like paying for your health insurance thing. And so, not to spiral the conversation in a different direction, but like you two already touched on, like, I feel like sometimes it can do more harm than good when people come out with things like this.
Yeah, I agree. I agree massively.
Yeah, and honestly, that understanding is honestly what led me to writing my second question, is that like I've seen a lot of just conversation regarding genetic testing in regards to understanding like the risk factors somebody has for developing Alzheimer's. Specifically for the APOE gene, like I think there has been now genetic testing that is ongoing, and the E4 allele has been associated with having a higher likelihood of developing Alzheimer's. And, you know, I just thought there might be a lot of ethical concerns here in regards to opening this genetic testing up to the like open to the public, especially considering what we've already previously talked about with there being a lot of miseducation and misconceptions in regarding to the genetic component of Alzheimer's, and Alzheimer's is a disease in itself. And I just wanted to ask you if you, like, I don't know, your thoughts on this being an option for the public. Like, do you think that the prevention aspect that it may provide is worth the possible stress and anxiety that may come with like offering this genetic testing, and like does it create more problems than it may solve?
Yeah, I think genetic counseling is an incredibly important idea. Genetic counseling meaning that people go and speak with a professional geneticist who will sit down and tell them exactly what all of the tests would mean for them. The tricky thing with ApoE is that this is a risk gene, not a causative gene. So there are three main versions of the ApoE gene, ApoE2, ApoE3, and ApoE4. And you have two copies of every gene. And having two copies of the E4 allele of ApoE does quite significantly increase your risk of developing dementia, but it doesn't mean you are going to get dementia. It's not a guarantee at all. Likewise, the E2 version of ApoE is protective. It reduces your risk of getting dementia. But even if you have two copies of that, it's not a guarantee that you won't develop Alzheimer's disease. So the general lifestyle advice that people are given of eating a balanced diet, exercising, not smoking, not drinking too much, that advice doesn't change regardless of what your genetics are. Everyone should be, if they can, trying to do those things. In some way, I think that everyone should be entitled, if they really want to know what's going on inside their bodies. However, I don't think it's useful. Certainly not with genetic risks, because while you might be more likely to develop a disease, there is no guarantee in any way that you will. The only caveat with this is that the current treatments for Alzheimer's disease that have been in the news a lot over the last year, which are amyloid clearing antibodies in the brain, people who have the ApoE4 allele are at greater risk of side effects. And so anyone in clinical trials taking these drugs has to be screened for their ApoE genotype. But of course, these are people who have already developed symptoms. So it's not going to be a shock to them. I don't think, I personally wouldn't bother finding out myself. I wouldn't want to know, oh, I'm a bit more likely to develop this disease, but there's nothing I can do about it. I should still be living my life in the same way. So really, I think that it's a different story for genetic causes of disease. I think it's useful for some people to know that information, but with genetic risk, I just don't see the value in it. But I think as long as people have a complete conversation with a genetic counselor, they are made aware of exactly what those conversations and what those test results are going to mean, and are given a really good set of resources to understand what their life is going to look like, then I think that people should be entitled to it if they want to, if it's feasible within the healthcare system to provide that. I certainly wouldn't recommend people doing DIY genetic testing kits and then looking at their results and having a big panic. I don't think that's healthy at all.
There's DIY genetic testing kits. I didn't even know that.
Well, things like is it 23andMe? I think it is.
Oh, okay. I thought
Certain,
like an ancestry.
yeah, my understanding is it's used for ancestry, but obviously to determine someone's ancestry, you have to look at genetic variants and what their genes look like as a whole. And I don't know exactly how these tests work, but I would imagine that there's some way of extrapolating data like that.
Yeah, like and honestly, don't quote me, but I remember my friend doing his 23andMe and like them saying that he was at a higher risk of developing diabetes. So I do think they give you health information as well as ancestry information, whether you ask for it or not, which I
Wow.
thought was very interesting.
Yeah, that is definitely, I don't know, like that. I don't know if I like it. All right. I actually think when I had first read this question, I thought actually it was about gene editing. Like I thought it was going to be about pre-selecting for embryos and not even necessary, which is its own like can of ethical worms to open. So I'm not going to get into that today. And to your point, I think I like once again, like I personally wouldn't do it. And like I feel like for an individual level, it might not always be that most helpful. I think the only case where I was like, okay, I could potentially see this being helpful is like a couple, like who wants to have kids and potentially like are both at elevated or both have this gene, potentially an elevated risk for the child. And even then, like it's very complicated. So I think more than anything, it should all be about informed consent. In the past, like I know that has been people's gripes with the scientific community, different research studies and clinical trials, just like people not having the informed consent of like what's being done to them, like what they actually have going on, and like how they can actively utilize this information to improve their life. So I think if they had those conversations with geneticists, it will kind of at least help with the ethical side of like how people can actually utilize that information going forward.
Yeah, definitely.
On that note, I know you touched on one treatment that has kind of been making the headlines, but we did want to ask you about what other recent innovations in Alzheimer's treatment and care that you kind of just wanted to highlight, different creative or fun methods that are being used to study Alzheimer's, because obviously I know that there's been developments on that end. And also on your TikTok page, you've talked about it a little bit, different clinical trials. I know they're very UK specific, but you could definitely discuss them. But yeah.
Yeah, so there's two particularly exciting things I think in Alzheimer's at the moment, and the first is the treatments. So very briefly touched on it earlier. These are treatments that target the plaques in the brain, and essentially they label the plaques and say, get rid of this, and then your brain's immune system comes through and removes the plaques from the brain. The tricky thing with this is that we know that tau is very heavily associated with people's symptoms, and we know that amyloid plaques start forming in the brain decades before someone gets ill. So while these treatments are removing amyloid, and they have in some people been shown to slow down the progression of Alzheimer's disease. So this is big, big news showing that this is something that this is a disease that we can, in theory, treat. We are able to slow down the disease, and that's where we're at with the current clinical trials. And there are more clinical trials ongoing with different versions of these drugs. So we've seen already in this last year that there are treatments that work that can slow down the progression of Alzheimer's disease. What's really going to be incredibly interesting is what happens when we give these drugs to people a little bit earlier on. So before any tau has started forming in the brain. In order to do this, we need to be able to diagnose people earlier, which I think is the most exciting thing at the moment for me, the idea of these biomarkers, these really specific biomarkers. And there is a blood test that has been developed recently that is currently doing the rounds and is going through 3 trials, which will allow, historically, if you want to get a biomarker diagnosis for Alzheimer's disease, that's going to involve having a lumbar puncture in your back, which is painful, time consuming. No one's having a good time. This blood test would massively speed up and also make things a lot cheaper and would allow people to get a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease in a much shorter time frame. And it's really important people get a diagnosis for multiple reasons. Firstly, if they get that diagnosis earlier on, they're able to better plan for their future. But also, these drugs that we're seeing at the moment in the Alzheimer's field, they appear to work better the earlier that you give them to someone. So the combination of we're developing these drugs and we're also developing these ways of diagnosing the disease earlier is a massive, massive step forward. And there are also tau clearing drugs going into clinical trials at the moment, which I think is going to be really interesting because what I imagine will be the case is that, like in diseases such as diabetes, you don't just take one medication, you take a handful of medications. I imagine that it will be the same for Alzheimer's disease, that it's going to be a combination effect that's going to be the most successful. So I think we're really, really excited to see where the field goes over the coming couple of years, probably. In terms of exciting techniques, I find every part of science exciting and fascinating. But maybe one of the coolest ones is something that I did a couple of years ago. It's this technique called spatial transcriptomics. So, transcriptomics is studying those RNA shopping lists that I was talking about earlier. And by studying these shopping lists, you can see how many copies of a shopping list are being made, therefore, how much of a protein you're going to make. And you can see in a diseased brain versus a healthy brain, are there any changes in which genes are being expressed more, which proteins are we having giving more instructions to make? And spatial transcriptomics is really cool because it's got lots of fluorescence, and you essentially have a piece of brain tissue and you bind what are called DNA barcodes on top. And then you use lasers to shoot those off, and you can select the exact part of the brain you want to look at and what types of cells in that part of the brain. And then you take off all of your barcodes and you can see exactly what is going on in the brain in that slice of brain that you're looking at. And I found it really, really interesting to look at. And hopefully we'll be publishing a paper on the results of that soon.
Okay, published. T. I love that for you. No, science is just funny because you look back and you look at like these huge, which cost millions of dollars, first of all. When I found out what the microscope in our lab costed, I started making jokes about how I was going to sell the parts because, listen, that tuition is not going to pay itself. But it's really weird because you just look at these machines that are doing like crazy things. And I'm like, how do I explain to like somebody who was living in the 1800s that like we have like, and yeah, you shoot lasers and then you can see the cells, and then it's just like, I know they would think I was a witch. Like,
Yeah, and I also definitely, oh, sorry, were you saying something?
No, you go on, you go.
I was just gonna say, like, I definitely relate to the idea that like research innovations in science are just very interesting to me. I remember I took this one neuroscience elective class that required that we go to a certain amount of symposiums regarding just any topic that was at least a little bit neuroscience. And I used to, especially like as like a freshman, like fresh into the field of neuroscience, I used to sit there just thinking like, wow, like the fact that someone even thought to use this research method, or like just like the creativity of that, or just also the amount of information that I would gain from those like symposiums, it genuinely made me feel like, oh yeah, we're gonna have that cure tomorrow. But obviously that is not the case whatsoever. But definitely in the moment, like I feel like I was just in such like shock and awe that people were being like so creative, so innovative, and to like get these answers and like figure out the like concoction that is the human brain. And that's like one of the last questions we wanted to ask you, like, through your journey in neuroscience, like, and especially in regards to dementia and Alzheimer's, have there been some discoveries or information that you've learned personally about dementia or Alzheimer's that has surprised you?
There's a couple of things that not necessarily surprised, but really interested me. The first one is actually I say relatively recent. It was about 2012 that the first paper came out about it. But this concept of the glymphatic system I find really interesting. So this is everyone's heard of the lymphatic system being the clearance system for the rest of our body, but it turns out that our brain has its own version of that, where it sweeps cerebrospinal fluid through the brain. And this primarily happens when we're sleeping. And this can clear out all of the bits of junk that are lying about in our brains. I think this is a really, really interesting field that's being studied at the moment. And I wish that I was able to do some research in that field because I think it's so interesting and the implications of poor sleep health on clearance mechanisms in the brain I find interesting. The other thing that I find interesting is in regards to Alzheimer's disease, everyone always thinks of this as death of neurons, brain cells causing the disease, and everyone has always thought of it as a very neuron-centric problem. But recently, all of the genetic studies that are happening, the GWAS studies, it's pointing at microglia as well in the brain. So these are the clearance cells of the brain, and it's looking like they're trying their best to do as good a job as they can at clearing these plaques of amyloid out of the brain and attacking those. But it gets to a point where they just become so overwhelmed that perhaps they're attacking our own brain cells and causing them to die. So this idea of how strongly microglia could be implicated in disease as well is something that I think did surprise me a bit actually, and I find it thoroughly fascinating.
Yeah, no, everybody treats neurons as the Beyoncés of the brain. We never focus on the gland. I remember learning about like their function in the neural system, and I was just like, we never pay attention to the glial cells. They're actually doing a lot, clocking in, day out,
So,
metaphorically and literally. And we never, you never hear edits about them on TikTok. People are never saying that their favorite cell is a glial cell. But what about them? What about them? Like.
yeah, exactly.
Honestly, I feel like when I was doing my bachelor's, like microglia, she actually got a lot of shine. Like obviously in the specific like area that I was in, of course, but yeah, I did also find that interesting. I actually had a professor who briefly like touched on the lymphatic system. And I remember the first time hearing that like association with like our cerebrospinal fluid in sleep. And I definitely have a little bit of hypochondriac tendencies. Like I don't know, that scared me so bad, especially when I knew I was not getting good enough sleep when I was trying to complete my bachelor's.
Yeah, yeah. I'm exactly the same, but I'm also too lazy to make any changes in my life. So,
Exactly.
but
You
speaking
know,
of Glia,
that,
actually, I told my mum about Glia the other day, and she drew.
Oh, that is literally the cutest thing. Oh my gosh.
is that cute? I love you need that on a shirt. I
Yeah,
love
I was thinking that maybe I need some merch or something.
I will definitely be your
but
first buyer.
that would be perfect. Touching on undergrad experiences, we're gonna get into everybody's favorite portion, of course, which is bits and BS. And to refresh the audience and Toby you as well, it's basically when we go over like funny, annoying, trying, exciting, maybe even kind of sweet moments that we kind of went through during our undergrad. It can also be master's or PhD for you as well. And since you're our guest lecturer, of course, we'll let you go first.
So I think when I was doing my undergrad degree, I don't know if the structure works exactly the same in the States, but it's a 3-year program. And in your third year, you do your dissertation. So you find a supervisor and you will do a research project with them. And in my specific case, I had done a research placement over the summer break that year. And I'd done a project working on nothing to do with the brain. It was epithelial sodium channels. And we would essentially inject tiny little frog eggs with DNA to allow us to produce these sodium channels on the outside of the frog egg. And then we could measure the electrical current. And I did these experiments and I loved it. And so I applied for my research project with him. And I spent 6 months every day trying the same experiment again and again and again and again. And I was looking at it in the context of evolution. So I was injecting DNA from different evolutionary periods and seeing what effect that had. And we couldn't get any data. We couldn't get any results at all. And we were really surprised. We thought, wow, it's disappointing. It's not the results we expected, but this is big news. This was not evolutionarily conserved. And the day that I submitted my thesis, we were going back and looking at some documents, and it turns out that the primer that we had used in the very original experiment was not the correct primer, and that the entirety of the last 6 months had been a complete and utter waste of time. I still managed to get a decent grade for that piece of work, but it led me to realize how difficult science can be, even without any of the science being involved.
Yeah, wet
that
lab work always scared me because of that.
that would send me into psychosis. I'm not gonna lie.
It'll be, don't mess up one thing on like a wet lab like project. Like it will be so over for you so quickly. Like it's like that always scared me when like I had to pipette anything where I was like, oh, I forgot to centrifuge this. Like, why are all of my cells dead? Like I'm about to start crying. Like you are honestly handling telling this story much better than I would be.
It was many years ago.
No, even like running experiments that for me only took a couple of hours, if I messed them up, I was literally like, I would get so frustrated, especially when I first started out in my research lab, because it would be like, okay, you make a mistake, you figure out like the mistake that you made, and you go and you run it again, and then you make a separate mistake. And like, sadly, that is the scientific method. Like, you have to just figure out how to do it before you can do it perfectly. But oh my God, that used to piss me off because it's just like, okay, I didn't pipette correctly this time. And then the next time, like, I didn't mix the solution correctly. And like, there came a point where I was like, how about I just tear out my hair and leave? How about I pursue a different career? Let me see if I can sing. Let me see if I can sing. Because at this point, like, I cannot do this anymore.
Yeah, scientific research definitely gives you your like welcome to the NBA moment, and it's just so painful no matter how canon the event is. And for my bit of yes, I was like, let me choose something from like neuroscience specifically. And it's funny because my friends and I used to always make a joke that everybody who's in neuroscience is there to figure out what's wrong with them. Because I swear to you, every single one of my professors were at best just very quirky people. Like just whole department was very quirked up. And I was just like, I will literally just tell you objective facts about one of my professors, and it'll probably be quite interesting. And it was actually the guy who taught me about the lymphatic system. Shout out to him. And he was a PhD student in his like, I think his 7th year of his neuroscience PhD. I'm not gonna try to ID him too much. And I remember him, I just feel like they were sucking the life force out of that man. Like, he literally was like, I'm not cutting my hair until I finish my PhD. Like, I'm looking at photos of him with like hair, like clearly not even half a inch long, like well above his ears. Like, this man has like shoulder length hair minimum at this point. He wore the same outfit every single day. Like, maximum, I think I saw him in like 2 outfits the entirety of this semester. And sometimes he'll be like, yeah, I didn't have time to make the quiz, so y'all all get 100. Our last final, don't got time for that. I'm putting in 100. Like, I feel like our department was just literally putting this man through it. But I mean, this was around sophomore year, so I'm like glad to say that he is a doctor now. He has done his dissertation. His hair is also cut. Like, and just shout out to him. He seemed like a really cool guy. And he honestly, I'm not gonna lie, did give me a little bit of fear for like potentially pursuing a PhD, but I just always was a little bit concerned for him, and also just kind of like it is though fitting for the area that you're pursuing, because I'm telling you, every single neuro professor has just something a little bit interesting about them.
I want to end up like him. You said I saw the future and it is not looking bright.
It was like, I just, I hope he's doing well now, but yeah, the way every single like person pursuing like a neuro PhD at my like university was, it was just like they all spoke about it like it was an uphill battle for sure.
No, you used to be telling me stories about your professors, and I'm like, they don't seem quite all right, but I'm like, that's culture over there. Okay, also, I've been looking to the side because I was like trying to pull up everything, and so I finally have everything up. So, in my third year spring, yes, my third year spring, I took a class. It was like clinical neurology, I think. It was basically like, as everybody knows, I was a biomedical engineering major, but this class was just like you got basically got like breath and death electives, and I think this was my death elective. My minor was my like breath electives, and death electives were just like you could explore different parts of biomedical engineering. So like some people did like robotics and machine learning, like you could do like more like kinesiology, stuff like that. And for one of mine, I wanted to do neuro. I never focused specifically on neuro. In fact, I say I focused more on cardiac stuff in the past. So I was like, this will be new. This will be fun. It was also, which was a heavy selling point for me, like asynchronous and online. So we never met, and it was basically be like I watched the videos and the slides and I went through everything. And basically after you did every lecture, I'm pretty sure like you took a quiz on like that week's lecture or whatever. And we were learning at this time, it was more statistical modeling based. And so we were going over an odds ratio. And I had to take like the quiz. And basically she had told us, mind you, from the slides, that if you had greater than 1 for your odds ratio, that meant that you had an increased odds of like whatever you were looking at, right? And then if you had an odds ratio of 1, that meant that there was no like statistical like difference. And so I answered, the question was like, oh, if this patient has like 1.08, does that increase their likelihood of like concussions to develop MS? And I was like, increased odds, 1.08. You told me that like greater than 1 means increased odds. No, I was wrong. I like messaged her on Canvas. I'm like, hey, like, can you just explain to me like why this was wrong? If you said there's like a positive correlation, when I tell you, this lady emails me back and she says, clue 1, common sense. I said, oh, oh, oh. Like, are you being serious? And like, let me read the full statement to you. Clue 1, common sense. The answer is barely different than 1 way out in the second decimal place. If odds ratio is approximately 1, there's no difference. And then clue 2 starts to get into like statistical significance, stuff like that. And I never even responded back to that message because I was like, she wants me to get ghetto. She wants me to get ratchet. She wants me to be mean back. And I'm not even going to say anything. Mind you, I had never met this lady because it was like a completely asynchronous class. And you know what? Maybe she wasn't trying to be malicious, but it still pissed me off. And I was just like, mind you, I'm in my junior year, which means I'm already going through a lot. Okay, I have other classes I've got to do. I'm trying to get an internship this summer. I'm like doing a lot. And you're telling me I need to use my common sense. I logged out and I went and I got myself a meal from the cafeteria because what else is there? What else is there?
No, like I always thought that like teachers or professors in asynchronous classes are the ones who used to get bucked the most. I don't know if it's because like you never think I'm gonna see you in person, and you're probably right. But I'm just like, why are we being mean? Like you really did not want to teach this class.
Yeah, we have the same problem over here as well. Some people are clearly being forced against their will to switch to students.
You can always tell the professors that are strictly here for their research. And I had a couple of those multiple times where it was like, you don't give a damn about me. Quite frankly, like you are rushing out this, you don't care, baby. You are here just like me to fulfill some credits. They used to laugh at us. I was like, oh my God, like I'm just trying my best. You want to be published in Nature, and that's your issue. You don't care about me at all.
Yeah, like they definitely had to corner you to teach this class. Yeah, but honestly, today was a great episode. Definitely already one of my favorites. I love talking all things neuroscience. Toby, thank you so, so much for coming on. Your explanations were great. I even feel like I learned so much this episode. And, for our audience, we always say, stay critical, stay educated. And, to make sure that is, we also will have some required reading that, talks about Alzheimer's, dementia, and some of the things that we touched on. And, I'm also going to just also put some resources for people who are going through a family member who has dementia or Alzheimer's, and some resources for caretakers as well. So it was nice to have this episode, and we'll see y'all next time. Bye.
Bye.